And without further ado, John Pilger.
This makes me feel very uncomfortable, but I'm going to stand here. Sorry. Happens occasionally. Look, terrific speech, Gary, and everybody else. And first I'd like to congratulate The Guardian on its exposure of the hacking scandal. And I think the meeting tonight is post-Hackgate, what do we do, isn't it? Something like that. It was a tour de force by Nick Davies. As a result of this fine journalism, it's quite likely that the Murdoch empire will disintegrate, certainly when the old man dies, and that's very good news. But Hackgate was a sideshow. And much of the media's navel-gazing since then has either missed the point or deployed the most effective form of censorship by omission. Hackgate was a sideshow to a rampant collusion so ingrained across the mainstream media that it almost never speaks its name. We journalists love the notion of bad apples. Murdoch's a bad apple. Blair was a bad apple, sort of. Gaddafi was a very bad apple. Unlike the Saudi tyrants, they're good apples. We also love the idea of worthy and unworthy victims. British soldiers, like American soldiers, are always worthy victims, no matter what they've done or why they've done it. In Libya, the revolutionaries, our revolutionaries, were worthy victims. But the people of the city of Sirte were unworthy victims. They were pro-Gaddafi, we were told. So it was okay to rain down fragmentation bombs on them and hellfire missiles to suck the air out of the lungs of their children. It was okay to airbrush the extraordinary bravery of the few who held out against our revolutionaries. And when 53 of these fighters were massacred by our side, we said little, we shrugged. They were unworthy victims. They weren't with us. They weren't on our side, and we'd already fallen for the lie exposed by Amnesty of Gaddafi's genocide in the East. So it was okay for the most liberal newspaper in Britain to run across its front page the bloodied face of a human being who had just been sodomized with a knife by one of our revolutionaries. Gaddafi was the most unworthy victim of them all. So it was okay to show the mob, our mob, doing its dirty work with us vicariously condoning the barbarism. The city of Sirte was demolished by our pilots and our revolutionaries. Untold numbers of innocent men, women and children were killed and maimed by us. How did the BBC report it? The city, said the BBC reporter, and I quote him, should be left as a memorial to Gaddafi's victims. Consider for a moment the intellectual and moral contortion required to make that statement. That Gaddafi's crimes pale against the crimes of our governments is unmentionable. Just as the slaughter in Fallujah in Iraq was unmentionable. Thousands were killed, almost nothing of the truth of that massacre appeared on the BBC, ITV or any of the main news. Why? Because the undeclared role of our free media is to minimise the culpability of rapacious governments, our governments, and at worst to cheer them on, to beat their drums, to dehumanise their enemies of convenience. That's why tonight I thought I'd concentrate on the phenomenon of war by media, because issues of life and death are most urgent. The American human rights lawyer Richard Falk wrote this: people in the West are encouraged to see the world almost exclusively through a self-righteous, one-way moral and legal screen with positive images of Western values and innocence always portrayed as threatened. And this validates a campaign of unrestricted political violence. I've been a witness to much of this violence. I've glimpsed the overthrow of some of the 50 governments dispatched by the United States with British support, many of them democracies. In Latin America, I've seen those tortured by forces approved and backed by our governments. Colonel Gaddafi had the approval and backing of the British government to torture people we didn't like when we liked it. But we, the benevolent ones, are seldom reported as the instigators of this violence, this terrorism that is far greater than anything that Al-Qaeda produced. Murdoch's lesser crime was hacking phones. But his unrecognised capital crime has been his organisation's unanimous support for the modern Holocaust that has enveloped and destroyed the lives of millions of people. Murdoch's appearance in Parliament was great theatre, wasn't it? But why wasn't he asked about the invasion of Iraq? Why wasn't Murdoch asked about 3 phone calls he made to Tony Blair in March 2003, including the day before the invasion, each call followed by warmongering front pages in the Murdoch press? Why didn't the MPs ask Murdoch about his phone call to Blair on January the 24th, 2004? That was the day after the Sun had leaked extracts from the Hutton report into the death of Dr. David Kelly, who had been hounded by Blair's spin machine. Murdoch's TV channels and newspapers, with an audience worldwide of more than 50 million people, have supported state violence for most of my career. But, and it's a big but, Murdoch is not a bad apple. Consider for a moment the 2 studies of the BBC's coverage of the run-up to the invasion of Iraq by the University of Wales, Cardiff, and the European organisation Media Tenor. They were barely reported. What they found was that the BBC's coverage overwhelmingly reflected the Blair government's propaganda, such as the lies about weapons of mass destruction. Less than 2% of BBC reporting in this critical period allowed dissenting voices, even though a majority of the British public were opposed to the invasion. Less than 2%. That's less than the most jingoistic American networks. On April the 9th, 2003, Andrew Marr, the BBC's political editor, stood outside 10 Downing Street and declared, and I quote, "Tony Blair said they will be able to take Baghdad without a bloodbath, and he has been proved conclusively right. It would be entirely ungracious for his critics not to acknowledge that tonight he stands a larger man and a stronger Prime Minister as a result." Unquote. It was like a victory speech. Researchers at Johns Hopkins University, the world's leading academic centre for measuring great disasters, estimate that more than 1 million people died as a result of Blair's and Bush's invasion of Iraq. They estimate the figure is higher now than even the Rwanda massacre. The Johns Hopkins work was first reported in The Lancet in 2006. The mainstream media sought to discredit it. Why? Because we, and I'm using the word we as it's so often used in the media, we destroyed the lives of 1 million people. And yet we, the British people, and certainly not the American people, have little idea of the sheer scale of this crime committed in our name. Last year I interviewed Dan Rather, America's most famous TV news anchor. He told me that he and others now believed that had journalists done their job and challenged and exposed the lies of Bush and Blair instead of amplifying and echoing them, the invasion of Iraq might not have happened, and perhaps those 1 million people would be alive today. My point is that the trail of blood leads not only to Murdoch, because the most important propagandists are seldom the least credible, such as the Sun, but those who enjoy the public's respect, like broadcasting. A WikiLeaks cable from the US Embassy in London described the extent of the understanding between the BBC and powerful politicians. This is the US ambassador advising Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and I quote him, I hope you can take some time out to tape an interview with the leading British journalist Andrew Marr on the BBC. It will be a powerful way for you to set out our priorities for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Marr is a congenial interviewer who will offer maximum impact for your investment of time. Unquote. What an accolade. Another WikiLeaks document describes a different kind of journalist. It's a 2,000-page document from the Ministry of Defence about how to prevent leaks, which was leaked. It says there are three main threats for the Ministry's view of the world. They are Russian spies, terrorists, and by far the greatest threat, independent investigative journalists. No greater compliment can be bestowed on those who do their job independently and fearlessly. During the 1970s, I filmed in Czechoslovakia undercover, which was then a Stalinist dictatorship, and I interviewed members of the dissident group known as Charter 77, particularly a very interesting banned novelist called Zenani Urbanek. This is what he told me. In dictatorships, we are more fortunate than you in the West in one respect. We believe nothing of what we read in our newspapers and nothing of what we see on TV because we know it's propaganda and lies. Unlike you in the West, we've learned to look behind the propaganda and to read between the lines. And unlike you, we know that the real truth is always subversive, unquote. Until journalists begin to understand this, the forces that are enveloping our societies will become ever more powerful. In Britain, the secret state is challenged only by journalists who are honourable exceptions. Our justice system is to change radically with secret courts in order to protect the adventures and crimes of the intelligence services. Dissent is being criminalised on both sides of the Atlantic. You see, I believe an historic shift is taking place, that social democracy is being drained of its life force and replaced by corporatism. The convergence of the main political parties is part of this momentous change, and the facade of it all is the mainstream media. Reading the WikiLeaks cables, what's clear is that the aim of great power is to eliminate the distinction between journalism and information control. So what do? Well, we've heard talk tonight of rebuilding the NUJ within the media. I would suggest we rebuild the media. I'd like to see the NUJ broach some of these often taboo questions. I'd like to hear the views from those standing for the NUJ's National Executive Council. So far, I can't find anything apart from references to Hackgate. It's important for the NUJ to campaign against cuts, to campaign against what's happening to the BBC, but it's even more important for the NUJ to stand up for the people of this country to have an honest, free media. It was Edmund Burke who described the press as a fourth estate, whose job was to check the pillars of power. Instead, the fourth estate is an extension of Vestas' power. Now, this has probably always been true, but we're in the 21st century and the dangers I've described are real and insidious. I'd like to see a fifth estate, in which journalists join with the public and those responsible for training journalists in formulating a new freedom of the press. Media colleges should stop training journalists as fodder for Murdoch or any of the other one-dimensional media. Those in charge of keeping the record straight should be held to account like anyone else. The NUJ has a critical role to play in this. Young journalists need to know that cynicism about their readers and viewers does not ordain them as journalists, that instead of looking at the world from the top down and taking officialdom at face value, they should reverse their skepticism, reserve